workshop, and we don't have too many hours with us, so we have to start at 11 and finish it at 1:30, so that we can settle down and discuss some of the broad ideas that we have. Can we have one chair for Debuda? You have a chair there? Okay. So please settle down.
So how is life? She's after the EBDC weekend. You were there? In New York? I met Anna Marie.
So good morning, friends, and a very warm welcome to this very, very informal workshop that we have. And we thought that we would do a follow-up of what all we discussed in the session in Delhi 5, focusing on methodology and how we go forward in terms of bringing in the idea of OECD's approach on assessment projects, the effectiveness, and the jargons that are associated with specific baggage, and how we go forward in terms of conceptual clarity on South-South cooperation to go forward. I think in the conference we discussed the idea of triangular cooperation being different from South-South cooperation, and how the new assessment framework should look at that, and what is it that South-South cooperation members and researchers can agree on a minimum template. We had excellent presentations by Noel, by Professor Lee Xiao Yin, and by Professor Milindo Chakravarti in the panel, and we had Pilani as discussant, and we also had Fenwell who supplemented the words that were there. So I think it's important for the academics to see what minimum sort of framework is possible. What is it that we can think of? And principles, of course, we all agree. They are adopted by governments at various points of time in history. And as RIS write-up showed, where we tried to compare the principles of different countries adopted to reflect the idea of South-South cooperation, those principles and their possible indicators are listed. We largely sort of tend to agree, though of course capturing that in form of statistics, etc., might be a challenge. But then on modalities and their indicators, we had some debate and we had some discussions. So that I think is important to today to capture in next 2.5 hours that we have in our hands. And I would first request Professor Lee Xiao Yin to bring in his ideas, and then Fenwell had some very important suggestion for us to consider and move forward. A similar project was led by Debuda in his work in a Center for Policy Dialogue in Bangladesh. So I would also request him to tell us what he did with his project. RIS was fortunate to host him to have this workshop that he did at RIS to expand the ecosystem and to bring in the conceptual framework that is needed. I would need one chair here to balance OECD with me on the hat table, so because that's where we would have to bring the balancing factor. So Mario should come next to me here. That would also help me bring in the sanity that is required in our discussions. So Mario, you're most welcome. We would also be trying to bring forward some sort of document as part of Delhi 5, so that we see where the red lines are and where we can stop and where we can move forward. The idea is not to adopt something or thrust anything on anybody. Idea is to have pure academic discussion, which would facilitate our collective understanding on the way indicators and modalities are to be looked at. So that, I think, gives us the heft that is required for impact assessment, as the need is largely being felt by the countries that are receiving these partnerships and are contributing in terms of the processes that are needed. So from that point of view, we would have to bring in the idea of South-South cooperation in a framework. As I said in the beginning, triangular cooperation as of now is out of our framework. We are not discussing that, because then a lot of issues would come up as to who would converge, who would prevail, whose modalities and whose approaches would be supported. So that, I think, all dimensions would come in, and we would have a major challenge in terms of how we are identifying the priority areas in the list. So a lot of issues would come up. So triangular cooperation, let us keep it out for the time being. From the RIS side, in the conference, we had circulated what we called as 5 modalities of development compact, and I hope all of you had this in your folder. So just to simplify the list of modalities, we have tried to see how these dimensions are getting measured. So a lot of things, and then I would also request my colleague, Professor Melindo, who had a presentation in the conference on this. Mario was also very actively contributing in the discussion. Now he is part of the group here, so we would be discussing this collectively. We also requested OECD DAC to be joining us for this informal workshop. Andre, I'm very glad that you could join us today morning, and we would, in next 2.5 hours, would try to evolve our collective understanding on this subject. So without further ado, I first request Professor Li Xiaoyin for his remarks.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you, Sachin, for your effort to make this available for all of us to continue our discussion. And before we start, as a chair, I wish I would have your permission to provide some suggestions for our agenda. And first, I would suggest I'm not going to follow the list here to call for everyone to make a contribution, because that looks like very mechanic and really not really good. And secondly, I would also suggest everyone to contribute in a very it's very, everybody will be constructive, but will be very how to say, very shortly, not very succinct. And thirdly, I would also like to invite our co-chair, Stefan, to provide some kind of introductory, very quick, short introductory input to help us to guide our discussion a little bit structured. Otherwise, we will come into different directions. And otherwise, I would again to invite you to provide your introductory contribution first. Yeah.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Sachin. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to this informal discussion. Just some thoughts, some personal notes, drawing again rather on my former capacity, though not speaking on behalf of any international institution. So let me start with 6 quick thoughts. The first thought, please change the slide. IT team. Great. You can probably not read anything, but this is just based on my last study at DIE together with Victoria Gonzio. Mario know it. what we are trying to say here in this, on this nice slide is that this is the development cooperation discourse, the recent discourse, and we have three main categories: the narratives, the strategies, and the operational dimension. And what we are saying in our study is we see an increasing dislink when it comes to the development cooperation discourse between those three main areas. Just to highlight one aspect, let's say 15 years ago, at least when it comes to OECD donors, we had this kind of aid effectiveness narrative, and that was relevant for the narrative level, that was relevant for the strategic debate, and it was also very relevant for the operational level. This is quite different today. We have a dislink. Yeah, we have a discussion on the narrative level, on migration, those things, and when it comes to operational level, it's quite different. This is just one aspect. My second point, and this is also part of this slide, we live in an area of post-aid effectiveness. Aid effectiveness, in a way, all, let's say, OECD donors would probably say this is still on the agenda. But if you look at what is taking place, where most important efforts are taking place, this is probably not really related to this. My third point is we have little global dialogue on development cooperation between the most important groups, South-South cooperation providers, and traditional donors or OECD. Of course, BABA plus 40 was a UN effort conference, but let's say it was mainly dominated for good reasons by South-South cooperation providers, and the other group was rather less represented. So this kind of dialogue is not really taking place. GPDC is another topic. We just had this last senior level, high-level meeting in New York. Sachin was attending. When it comes to GTP and GPEDC, we still have the challenge that main partners, main South-South cooperation providers are not taking part in this kind of dialogue. My fourth point is, and this is drawing on what Antia was presenting in New York a couple of weeks ago. Is she still around? She was making a very important point that she was saying, regardless of which kind of development cooperation modality we are looking at, there are always strategic consideration and foreign affairs interest involved. But from my perspective, and it's something what is really different today, at least when it comes to OECD donors, this kind of strategic approach is much more important. Looking at the topic migration, I think looking at the situation in North America and the impact also on South-South cooperation from Latin American providers, I think that's very relevant. Looking at the situation in Europe, how important the migration aspect is dominating the whole development cooperation discourse, this is something what is highly relevant. So foreign affairs, strategic interests are much more dominant nowadays. My fifth point, and I'm coming to the end, measuring is a key aspect. I think the panel yesterday was a great example in this regard, and we should really put a lot of effort in technical terms, but also in, let's say, the narrative of measurement. Looking at GPEDC, that's very similar, that GPEDC and the latest monitoring round is probably a key aspect in terms of what is really the rationale to have GPEDC. The same applies, of course, also to the OECD. So my last point, and that's a bit the bridge to the discussion, is if we are considering all these aspects, what does it mean in terms of upcoming discussions? What is the discourse from an academic perspective, from a think tank perspective for the next 5 to 10 years? I think that's not an easy question against the background of those quite often conflicting debates, conflicting interests. And with these words, I would like to hand over again to the chair.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your highlight for us, quite well structured, considering the development cooperation. And before we start our discussion, I'd like to first, based on what Stefan provided, I'd like to especially invite three prominent persons here sitting around this table to give us a very quick view on what Stefan provided, particularly focus on three issues. One issue is that in terms of development cooperation effectiveness, and OECD DAC members have been working for decades through different agendas, Paris Declaration, Accra Action Plan, and GPDCE, whatever. So I'd like to invite Gerardo quickly to give us a review why those different investments over decades have achieved a little success. Why? So I would like you to address that issue very quickly. And then secondly, I would also like, after Gerardo, invite Professor Sachin to give us a quick overview on what kind of new ideas and new approaches actually emerging over the last decade toward that issues. And lastly, I also like to invite my friend Deb, you, to give us your critical view on the obstacles, problems, and any issues in front of us toward that issue of development cooperation effectiveness. You are the expert, excellent expert. Give us your views, and we also would like again to listen to your grandmother's reminders. Thank you very much. Okay. Okay. So first,
I accept you as my grandfather.
yeah, well, certainly. Gerardo, very quickly, okay? No, very quickly.
Well, I'll do my best. I haven't prepared very much for this, but I very much agree with Stefan's presentation, and my impression is that I think with you is that the aid effectiveness agenda has been losing strength, power from Busan to now. So it's already almost 9 years. And why has been that? I think the first issue was this impossibility of creating a real global partnership. We, as you know, I mean, we kind of made a global partnership in Busan, but it disentangled very quickly, and already in Mexico, China, India, and Brazil decided not to participate for reasons that we can discuss. Professor Lee has written about this. Myself, I've written about this. It's not. We won't repeat this discussion. Why it failed?
What lessons we should learn today from that process?
Well, I mean, from my point of view, I think it was from both parts. We failed from both parts. On the one hand, I think, and it's here in our paper today. On the one hand, I think that the emerging donors, and I'm talking about Brazil, India, Mexico, and of course China, failed to really come up with a good alternative, with a good concept on common but differentiated responsibilities. We didn't come with the differentiated responsibilities that we should want to put in practice. We didn't follow a process to distinguish these responsibilities. That was on the one hand. And on the other hand, funny enough, the traditional donors didn't like the idea of differentiation either, because they, as I see it, they, by their genetic want to impose their own view. And so in my perspective, they kind of agreed with this concept in Busan, but didn't take it seriously. So in the end, neither the emerging donors nor the traditional donors took seriously this idea of differentiation. And since there was no real support for creating these two types of partners that could actually start discussing together, the whole thing fall apart in Mexico. And since then, I think it hasn't recovered. So that's one point, that the global partnership was never, it was a global partnership, I think, for less than 2 years or even a few months only. That was one point. And then the second point, and I think that goes also to Stefan's presentation, is that the donors themselves have lost interest in the effectiveness agenda, because they, and I agree completely with Stefan, they are putting first their own strategic, their own national interests. And of course, what we have to be clear is that the effectiveness agenda implies efforts from donors. It's not like a 0.7 effort, which is a quantitative effort that everybody understands, but it creates effort, for example, to the link, not link your aid. It creates an effort to be transparent. It creates an effort to apply ownership. It does create an effort, and these guys don't want that effort anymore. They prefer to do what they feel it's best for them. So for those reasons, I think that the effectiveness agenda has
very good. Thank you very much for your introduction contribution. So I'd like to just ask Sachin if you could just follow up very quickly that what kind of new ideas, new innovations and approaches emerging over the last decade to respond to that issues, particularly whether those you consider as innovative in the future and now, and who would respond to the failure of what Gerardo just mentioned. Yeah.
Thank you, Chair. Thanks a lot. I think last 20 years have seen remarkable shift in the global architecture on development cooperation, and of course on in the global aid architecture. And this canvas has evolved in various different respects in terms of its contents, in terms of its focus, and also in terms of its contours, which are defining the conceptual frameworks. We need to learn lessons from the failure of Busan. And Busan failure is right on our face, those who are undermining the changing global landscape and the authority with which the rise of the South is evident on the global horizon, is absolutely telling in terms of how no more same old games can be played. We have witnessed those games in WTO, we have witnessed those games in many other multilateral fora. West has to realize the fact that policy space for developing countries is absolutely essential. Busan never envisaged institutionalization of the global aid architecture led by OECD, but this was not respected by the countries which were leading the Busan process, and as a result, we ended up with the institutional architecture with which South was not connected. So inviting on a laid out table to the South and presume that South is going to accept that has not been the case since Cancun failure of the WTO talks, and I think that trend is continuing. Rise of the South has to be given due respect with different modalities and principles of the South. It cannot be on the principles of the North. So this absolutely has to be very clear. Busan only could provide paragraph number 2, where we could bring in South-South cooperation as another mechanism, which OECD had rejected in the Accra meeting of 2008. So this, I think, is absolutely clear, and this is the lesson we should learn from the failure of the global experiences. Unfortunately, GPEDC, in its high-headedness, continued to go ahead with the idea of imposing the OECD DEC architecture on South-South cooperation. It's now that China, India have consistently not participated in the GPDC that we have now no global platform to have a dialogue. And this is the reason why a global solution to the problem is not coming in, despite of the rise of quantums in development assistance by China, India, Brazil, South Africa, and many other emerging countries. In RIS, we are, Mr. Chairman, consistently tracking down even smallest of the South-South cooperation budgetary expenditure by the South. And I'm glad to mention that the global database that we are creating is keeping a track on how fast this is rising. So it is important for us to realize these dynamics. OECD countries are trying now to reach out to through triangular cooperation. But as my colleague, Professor Gladys, very rightly mentioned, that SSC plus TRC is not equal to what it should be. So that is something which is a challenge lying on the table, which we should address. So that's my point number one, why Busan has failed and what lessons we should learn. The lessons that I think we should learn first is to realize the geopolitics, and as Stefan very rightly mentioned, that the national interests are dominating. What is also happening simultaneously, Stefan, let me also mention that, is the weakening of the civil society in Europe and their role that they played in terms of keeping the governments on track. US never had that, and US never wanted, and fortunately with the current president, nothing else is needed than business enterprises. So that, I think, is, it's absolutely transactional for him, so he doesn't need anything else. If you are my friend, you are going to get the assistance that USID would be engaged in, otherwise you are out of the table. So that's what US is proposing. So this differentiation of South-South cooperation and its convergence and possibilities of its convergence with the triangular cooperation is something which is important. Third point is the donor fatigue. We have been apprehending that for very long. Now it is becoming all the more clear. Australia in last 5 years has reduced 36% of its ODA contribution, despite the fact that we are expecting them to respect the targets that they are expected to of 0.7% of the GNI, but Australia is sliding. We are seeing rise from DFID. We saw it in 15, we saw it in 16, 17 we were expecting, there was no rise, 18 there was no rise. I hope to see that in 19. So we find a sort of weakening there. In my view, what we can do now is the new pragmatism that we are seeing in South, both exhibited by China and also by India. There is now greater willingness to bring some sort of impact assessment. China has engaged with the OECD group, and Professor Li Xiaoyan himself was co-chair of the China OECD study group. I think similar initiatives are to be strengthened, because now more and more countries are bringing in the mechanisms that are necessary for impact assessment. So what kind of impact our expenditure is bringing in, that I think is absolutely important. But as throughout the Delhi 5 conference, right from the inaugural till the concluding session, we were extremely cautious in terms of mentioning that it should not be replica of OECD DAC framework. So if it is not going to be lock frame approach or any other OECD DAC framework, what it should be, what it should look like, what it should bring in terms of capturing the modalities of engagement, in terms of in-kind contribution, in cash contribution, and also in terms of, as Fenwell very rightly reminded us, if you love your wife, you don't have to tell how much. So Fenwell was very right that we have to be mindful of that statistics and need not get too much obsessed by numbers and quantification. But as an economist, I fully agree that quantification to some extent is possible. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think you should see you should see how much you love your wife, otherwise, you get troubles. Anyway, and it's very great contribution for this, and also, and also for, it seems that it's quite clear that triangle cooperation will become more and more important to bring that gap, in the future, particularly in terms of two sides. One side is aid fatigue, what you said, and aid fatigue people get really tired about aid anyway, and then we have no solution. How we going to improve? What we're going to do? So this is something, and in terms of modality and triangle cooperation would be something which we need to really look at quite seriously, because not just ignored. And lastly, I like to invite Deborah for your great contribution. Expect.
Thank you very much, Professor Lee. I look at this morning as a great intellectual opportunity for me and my team, which have been working on the new agenda for development effectiveness. I would like to share some of the results because Sachin persuaded me to stay back for this, and I really do not regret that. Particularly, I also saw an opportunity to test out, validate some of the recent conclusion of the work which we are doing over here. So I won't go into the heritage and baggage of all this discourse which we are having over here. This is a very informed group of people, so they don't need reminding all these things. I will just touch upon only the background, which all the earlier speakers have mentioned. I think this is the moment. This is my point. This is an opportune moment to bring a qualitative change in the discourse on South-South cooperation and development cooperation from the OECD, DAC, GPDC perspective. I mentioned 3 points, which will be part of it is repetitive. First, the GPDC and its paraphernalia is running out of political steam, which we saw even in a weekend meeting in New York recently, and the outcome is quite bland in some way. So this is number one. Number two, I borrow Sachin's word, the new pragmatism which we are seeing within India and China in terms of to engage further. It's an expression of confidence. We have seen that. It's a process issue in that way. And the third, I think, is that we have now accumulated a substantive critical amount of knowledge and instruments and tools and a group of people who can take this thing forward in that way. And today's morning is a testimony to that. These are the three issues, I think, which creates the new opportunity for this particular discourse to take forward. Now, the study which we are doing at CPD with the Southern Voice Network, and I'm leading that, and my colleagues from CPD, Mustafiz, Famida, they're all involved in that, and this is a Gates Foundation supported project, which essentially trying to, at this moment, put the knowledge base, consolidate the knowledge base, and I'm putting, which will lead to a number of country studies where these methodology will be tested. So what is the methodology which we have now put together? It's basically, after doing the literature scanning, we have 9 knowledge products already. They are online at the Southern Voice Network. So on the literature review, on the empirical assessment review, on the data opportunity review, both the new data, what type of new analysis can be done on that. The political economy analysis, we have carried out 2 country studies, case studies in Uganda and Bolivia for that. And then it comes to a situation where we can think of a framework which we want to apply to generate empirical validation for a framework. Now, I just pick on one particular issue given the morning, and it's the grandmother again in the morning and the difference she has said that if Professor Lee is chairing some session, they were tried to say 3 points, just make it 1. and so let me make it 1 point. What is the intellectual or the conceptual point of departure what we are making here? You see, one particular issue which has been oft-repeated is that South-South cooperation and the OECD DAC cooperation, there are common but differentiated principles. So can we unpack this particular catchphrase, common but differential. So our whole study, one of the kingpin of the study, is tries to unpack or formulate this proposition, which can be empirically tested at the ground level as it goes. So let's see what are the elements of that common and commonality and what are the differentials which we see. The first and foremost difference which we put forward is that does South-South cooperation accept the concept of the final objective, whatever that means, of development effectiveness? So we go through the BAPA plus 40 and we find the word development effectiveness of South-South cooperation. So the word development effectiveness in BAPA plus 40 has shown up. So the issue is whether South-South cooperation would like to conceptualize with any other new concept of effectiveness. So development effectiveness, good, bad, or ugly, it has its own content. The first and foremost point what we put forward, what if we agree on measurement, what are we measuring in terms of the conceptual part of it? So can we derive there without decomposing it further by its elements and as it goes? The first and foremost decomposition what we do is the scope of it. The scope gives out very clearly differences over there. There are two specific components over here that development cooperation is essentially, and the GPDC concept is essentially based on concessional financial flows. That is essentially the concept. South-South cooperation is much more than that. What we see in the recent past, that many developing OECD countries in the recipient countries are setting up forums called Forum for Economic Cooperation. So the issue is, where does the development cooperation ends and where does the economic cooperation starts? And what we talk about South-South cooperation is essentially more than development cooperation in the GPDC sense, which is closer to the economic cooperation sense, which brings in trade, investment, and finance. So can we have a clarity on the scope part that we are dealing with more than development cooperation, economic cooperation? These two. On the other the package unpacking what we have done on the basis of three issues: premise, principle, and assessment. So what are the premise issue? The premise issue, we take out three over here. One is, if you take the GPDC jargon, it's national ownership. And if you take the South-South cooperation jargon, it is demand-driven. So is there an area, is it linguistic or there is a conceptual difference between what is demand-driven is supposed to lead to national ownership, or what is national ownership should be demand-driven? So this is one point. The second point on the premise is that partnership. So on the one hand, the word is partnership. On the other hand, the word is mutual accountability. Can there be a partnership without mutual accountability? Or mutual accountability presupposes partnership? That's the other premise on that. The last one is result orientation. Interestingly, BAPA plus 40 has made a great stride in saying that we are looking for an incremental result-oriented approach. So that makes it easier. So both are really looking at results, but which results we are talking about? That's another issue. So these are the premises. On the principles, we take out four at least on that. One is that GPDC, these are the differentials now. And the principle shows the differences in many ways than the premises. The principles, the first one is that GPDC is commitment-driven, 0.7%. South-South cooperation is voluntary. So if it is commitment-driven and it's voluntary, will they end up in the same type of results? You remember yesterday we discussed, somebody, I wouldn't have dared to raise it, but came from the floor, that whether there can be a voluntary target for South-South cooperation on concessional or any other things on that. But one is on this. The second is, if you see the GPDC talks about harmonization, use of national processes, whereas the South-South cooperation talks about solidarity. And if you look at the policy coherence, it talks about non-interference. So coherence without being non-interfering, can that be really operationally possible? Or that's the conditionality issues and other things will come up. These are which are the differences. And the last difference, which is very critical, is that GPDC in the post-Paris circumstances has committed to untying of full aid. South-South cooperation talks about mutual benefit, so which may include a bit of a time. So, and these are the sum of the. My last point on the assessment, interestingly, both South-South cooperation and the OECD, both are process-driven. These are not necessarily outcome-driven. These are very, very process-driven. Both are process-driven. So issue is what type of process indicators we are going to pick up in this particular ways. OECD has uniform definition. South-South is pluralistic definition over there. So assessment becomes difficult with the pluralism in the definitional part as both premise and principles. The other is the the voluntary, and the other is the major critical assessment problem comes at the scale and scope issue. And the scale issue is that till now, South-South cooperation, because of possibly of its scale and or its approach, is still project level assessment, not macro level assessment, neither meso level assessment. Whereas the GPEDC has gone into the effectiveness into the macro, if not to global and etc., because the commitments and other things are very global on that. So, and then comes in the monetization dimension, of course, along with that, because this is only flow issue on that, trade investments are not there, so how it goes. So what I'm trying to say, we have an opportune moment to take this debate forward, whereas there is a convergence in attitude, and particularly we have now a dedicated group of people. And from our point of view, I can tell you, if you kindly give me some feedback on the issues which I have put on the table, on their correctness or wrongness, and guide us a bit more. So we will be able to finalize this whole thing. And last year, I launched the study in the sidelines of the Bank Fund meeting. And in October, I'm going to take the Bank Fund meeting sidelines, this whole thing. In Bapa, we did a side event. I want to go to China with these results. And this is the second time the RIS very kindly hosting us with these results. So they have made a contribution. Their thoughts had been reflected as much as possible. But the responsibility is all mine. Thank you very much for this morning.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Really, really, the wisdom from your grandmother, it's great. It's really, really great. I'm sorry. Yeah, it's really, really good. Deborah, what you have highlighted very clearly the comparison, particularly the linkage between these two approaches. And at the same time, we have to also keep in mind that social cooperation is different from OECD DAC. It's not systemized. It's not standardized. Not standardized in the sense of that way, but it's very, very diversified. Therefore, the so-called incommons, a lot of incommons in practice are not incommons. If you look for the word expression, there looks very similar, but actual conduct on the ground is very much in country Pacific. It's very different, even politically, even technically. So, therefore, to come up a kind of a comparison, to look for either convergency on something which we share, and I have no idea for this, but I want to just open for floor, for discussion for those issues to help either this round table to clarify those big issues, and also, so I would now open for, please. I would stop you if I consider you are
very brief. I'm just grateful that Sachin raised the issue of geopolitics, and I think it's important to keep that in mind for two reasons. While we look back for lessons and look ahead as to what are the prospects. One reason why there's donor fatigue, particularly from the traditional donors, is because they were looking internally. We haven't talked about the migration crisis, the refugee crisis in Europe. And suddenly there's switching. So Sachin, a lot of that, reduction is that kind of driver driven by that. That's number one. The second is keeping in mind the same geopolitics. And Sachin, you very rightly pointed out the new pragmatism driven primarily by India and China. I just want to caveat that. It exists at the moment, but can we be sure it's going to continue into the future? And this is where the geopolitics is going to become important. Because if there are other geopolitical contestations between the southern countries, how is that likely to impact this process going forward? And how do we secure against that? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Milindo.
Thank you, Chair. The ideas put forward by Debuda is really very interesting, but I have some comments which I find which I find a little difficult to agree to. But the idea that you have been trying to portray as in terms of the premise that there is a sort of uniformity in terms of national ownership on the one hand and demand-driven on the other hand. I would like to refer to the theoretical literature on the issue of property rights. And the theory of property rights says that ownership is defined by a condition where the benefits and the control are enjoyed by the same entity.
Okay.
Whereas in case of donor or GPEDC perspective of development projects, it is often argued that the control over the activity and the benefits or losses out of the activity do not rest on the same entity. Whereas when we are talking about demand-driven perspective, we are not just looking at this from this angle of the share, the control and the benefit or loss per se. So from a theoretical perspective, I think demand-driven cannot be called to be similar to the understanding of national ownership. To take the cue from Professor Lee, I would like to expand it a little bit. You are absolutely right in saying that both these processes are process-driven. There is no doubt of it. But you also have mentioned that the processes are not the same. So just because the noun is the same, you cannot say the verbs are the same. So the same noun can be used with different connotations in terms of how it is being implemented. You rightly mentioned that there is an unitary perspective and there is a plurality in the process itself. But what I would like to make very, very clear that there is a distinct difference in terms of the processes followed under GPEDC and South-South cooperation. You also mentioned it is in terms of concessional finance, being the main modality on the one hand, and the other modality is being introduced in the context of South-South cooperation. And that leads to a very, very critical point that I am a little perturbed with, that if you say that development effectiveness is the common term used across these two, perhaps I have my problems there. Because if I look at, because you rightly said that the term development effectiveness has not been properly defined, and we use different definitions in this context. But if you look at, unfortunately, I would take the blame on our side, that we have not been able to define effectiveness from the perspective of South-South cooperation as to really we mean by that. But as the existing term goes, development effectiveness is considered a sort of a process which has been, whether the effort has been able to realize the objectives or the goals. That is how DAC defines effectiveness. But the literature is now very clear, even from our friends from the DAC member countries, those researchers, that whose objectives are we talking about? Whose objectives are being fulfilled? And that is perhaps not very clear. From RIS, to some extent, and at a personal level, if you go beyond it, my understanding of development effectiveness today, while we are comparing between OECD and the SSC processes, is perhaps in terms of the transactions cost in development delivery. If that can be reduced, then we can call that the development process or whatever it is, whether these two and to what extent these two processes are effective. If it is seen, and my gut feeling is from the existing database and from the existing ideas, that the transactions cost of development delivery would be found
Very hot.
Huh?
Will I go outside?
So, yes. Maybe we can think about.
I'll give you 1 second, okay?
Pardon?
1 second.
more.
Well, okay. No, I'm just saying that I am not very, I am not very comfortable about saying the different components of transactions cost, but the process may be initiated to find out as to what are the transactions cost and to what extent we can use it as a measure of development.
I think it's excellent.
Thank you.
Excellent, Minindo. I have to grant you. Excellent. Excellent contribution. So this is really, really very, very constructive and critical debate. I think basically we would like to have, I would like to have such a contribution discussion. And I have attended many of this kind of workshops, discussions. This is just from right beginning, I was speaking to Stefan. This already appears to be very, very constructive and, very powerful. And Paulo, yeah, and then Diana. So I would collect everyone. I'm not miss anyone. Not miss anyone. I know, yeah.
Just
Everybody will have chance to speak. No worry.
try to make 3 points. Actually 4. I have a trouble with the idea of pragmatism, because every country was always pragmatic on issues related to development cooperation. But I think something new is happening, definitely. And I would not call that pragmatism. I would call, we have been called, Sachin has called that, Southernization for a reason. And the reason is, I think that's the point that Gerardo touched upon. The reason is the rise of the discourse of burden sharing from the side of the North, and the refusal or the resistance, the growing resistance against the idea of common but differentiated responsibilities. And this is something that has happened during the last 20 years. And now the situation we have is that the North traditional donors are adopting the concepts of the traditional concepts of the South. And that my point regarding your comparison, my trouble with that is not the fact that I don't think they are so similar, but from my perspective, they are becoming similar because despite the differences between ownership and demand-driven, and the differences are huge. If you ask the Brazilian government, my government, what they think about demand-driven, they're going to say, "Oh, it's a letter from the government asking us to do something." That's demand-driven. And the government represents the country, and there is no necessary process of consultation. And I rather prefer to understand that ownership encompasses more than a letter from the government. So what's happening, it's not that demand-driven is becoming more alike ownership. It's the other way around. Ownership is becoming more alike demand-driven. When the idea of non-interference comes, the idea of non-interference, which is something coming from the South, when the idea of non-interference comes and is being said and be pronunciated by traditional donors, it comes with the idea of the use of country systems. So the very idea of alignment, which was in Paris, the alignment is the alignment of between the donor system with the recipient system. It's the alignment between two systems. Correct if I'm mistaken. But now they are talking about the use of country systems. I'm not wrong about that, I believe. And the use of country systems is precisely aligned or closer to the principle of non-interference, which creates a problem, a huge problem, particularly for countries like mine, which are not emerging anymore, it's submerging, or to use a qualification of a friend who is here, and but I will not identify him, but to not create any trouble, we are actually emerging recipients. For these countries, when the vocabulary of non-interference comes, and strengthens the use of country systems, that pressures the country systems to go lower, to flexibilize all the protections that we already have. So I agree with the comparison, but I don't think the comparison is actually how the South is matching the principles from the North. The comparison is actually how the North is actually lowering their principles to match the South. Chair, just one last question. And the other thing that we have to look at with really careful is the amount of resources that are being drained from ODA through the way the very concept of ODA is being stretched. If you take Germany last year, or the year before last year, it was fantastic. Germany almost reached 0.7, and this is a work done. You reach. This is a work done by a German researcher, and what they found was they reached the 0.7 because the in-country expenditure made all the difference between what they had before and the 0.7. So they're actually spending money on refugees and reporting that as ODA. As they are spending money as the UK is spending money on refugees and things like Prosperity Fund, which is basically a way to give a boost to the private sector to invest abroad. So the very idea of ODA is being stretched in a way that we are scrambling North and South in such a way that we cannot differentiate one for another.
Thank you.